Hello everyone and welcome to another session of AP Human Geography with Mr. Elrod, continuing on in Unit 3, discussing cultural patterns and processes. And today what we're going to look at is we're going to look at this idea of how is it that culture and the landscape interact with one another, and how is it that either the people impact the environment or the environment impacts the people in terms of their cultural development. So the first thing we're going to discuss is a man by the name of Carl Sauer. Carl Sauer is an important American geographer who really looked at this issue during his studies. He looked at the environment and the culture and how those two interact with one another. And over the years, his ideas are going to change, but he eventually kind of lands on he would have either been a possibilist or environmental determinist. Basically, he comes to the conclusion that really no matter how you slice it, people are always going to leave an impact on their environment, regardless of how low their level of development or primitive they are. It doesn't really matter. People are always going to impact the environment in some kind of way, whether it's the people living in the Amazon rainforest, even in our world today, they'll impact the environment by making their tree houses, by making clothes for themselves, by making tools and weapons to go hunting with. They're going to impact the environment that way. And of course, the Americans in the most developed of societies, we're going to impact the environment also, whether it's through the different pollutants we put in the air or into waters and things like that, or the way that we shift the environment to meet our needs, putting up dams and creating lakes and hydroelectricity, or clearing land to build schools and neighborhoods. So again, it doesn't really matter. People are always going to impact the environment. And really, if we look at the culture of the people and the way they interact with their environment, that really, again, tells us a lot about who they are, what's significant to them, and things that they're going to focus on. And when we talk about people living in a place, if we want to understand maybe the place itself, not necessarily maybe the culture, but the place itself and some of the transitions it's undergone, we look at this idea of what's called sequent occupance. And sequent occupance happens when two different types of people inhabit the same space, and we look at how they leave different marks on the landscape. And this is more of a historical idea. You look back over the ancient civilizations and you look at how the different people interact with the same space, especially maybe after they came in and took over space that another group of people had been inhabiting, whether we're talking about ancient civilizations, the Greeks and the Romans as they moved into Europe or into parts of Asia. If you look at how the Ottomans and the Islamic empires with Muhammad and how they moved across North Africa, and how that's going to differ from the Berber populations that were living there, and not just what they were going to do in terms of shaping the environment, but then the types of religious activities that would be taking place. And of course the Europeans, as they came over to the Americas and started conquering territory, you look at how they interacted with the environment and treated the environment differently than the native people did. So you get kind of an idea of what sequent occupants looks like. And you can even see this in your own neighborhoods today, especially as new groups of people move in. You can see the businesses that are going to open up to cater to those particular people, maybe new places of religious worship. I know where we're at. We have a contingency of folks moving from India, so you start seeing we actually have some Indian grocery stores opening up, Indian restaurants opening up. We have Hindu temples that are opening, and so that's going to leave a new mark on the landscape. In a town nearby, there's a fairly large Korean population, so you see Korean stores. The signs themselves are even in Korean, and so you know that those are going to be there trying to attract business from the folks who have moved into the area. So again, you can even see it some in your own neighborhoods as new groups of people start to move in, and you start to have to change in the landscape to fit their needs and the things that they want. When we talk about the interaction between the environment and people, and how is that going to affect them and affect their development, there are three theories that we talk about, and there are actually a couple more, but we'll just stick with these three. We have what's called environmental determinism, possibilism, and cultural determinism. And if you think about these along the lines of a continuum of, if you think about them in terms of a continuum of philosophy, and I know that's not a straight line at all, is it? If we think about maybe environmental determinism would be down here on one end, possibilism would be about here in the middle, and then cultural determinism would be down here on the very far other end. And if we think about it in terms of the way that the environment impacts humans or the humans impact the environment, we'd start way down here with environmental determinism, with the environment being the main factor that's impacting, down here to cultural determinism, where it's the culture that impacts the environment and how people are going to interact with it, and then possibilism kind of in the middle there. And we'll go through each of these three, and that's why they're in this order, because it kind of moves from one extreme to the other. When we talk about environmental determinism, it's this idea that the environment is going to determine the outcome of the behavior and development of a people. So really, the idea of environmental determinism is this idea that the environment is going to create a certain cultural and developmental outcome. And so, of course, this is a much more traditional, older idea. It's this idea that people are not able to overcome their environmental barriers. And the people's environment is going to be, the people's development is going to be limited by the environment. And this makes some sense if you think historically. If you look at places that did not have a lot in terms of natural resources. Jared Diamond, of course, went and looked at the people of Papua New Guinea, and one of the conclusions that he comes to about this idea that they call cargo was that they simply did not have the natural resources necessary in order to develop into a more developed, more advanced society, especially things like iron ore to make iron tools, and also the different types of crops that were necessary to sustain larger populations. And so that's kind of his outcome, is that because the people of Papua New Guinea had no way of getting these things, and really there was no way for them to develop into a more advanced and wealthy society. And so, of course, this idea of environmental determinism, you can kind of see it in a historical sense. You think about the different people across the world, and prior to trade and prior to global interactions, and of course, it would make sense that people had difficulty overcoming some of their environmental barriers, and they could only go so far, especially if the environment they were living in was particularly harsh. This helped the Europeans to kind of come to some of the conclusions about why they had developed and advanced, and some of the people in the tropical areas, parts of Africa and the Caribbean, had not. Adam Smith talked about South Carolina being the perfect place for government, and the Europeans thought that the climate, the temperate climates that they had, were much more beneficial to industriousness and things along these lines. So again, kind of in a historical sense, the environmental determinist theory makes sense because there wasn't as much global interaction. So of course, people living in harsher conditions are going to have difficulty overcoming them. If you think about the things that people use for clothing, for food, for housing, before global interaction and global trade, of course, the things that they're using are going to be limited to the resources that are nearby and available to them. The next step is what's called possibilism. And so possibilism is developed as a counter to environmental determinism, and it's a little bit more positive in that what it says is that yeah, the environment creates some sort of limitations, but people are able to make certain decisions that will help them overcome the environment. So this allows for some human development, some human advancement. People are interacting with the environment to change it and to make it work in their favor. But these decisions that they're making can only be made within certain parameters, and so it still recognizes this idea that there still are certain limitations put on people by their environmental factors. So even though they can make some changes, make some decisions, there's going to be some certain limitations to that, because some environmental barriers just might be too difficult to overcome. You think about tropical climates, you think about the diseases that are more prevalent in those areas, much more difficult to overcome, especially if we don't have medicines to take care of them. You think about in tropical climates and in very hot, dry climates, the difficulty of overcoming those conditions to grow enough food for your population. So it would make some sense within kind of those frameworks or those particular conditions. Then there's this idea of cultural determinism. This is a much more positive outlook on life and on people and their situation. Basically, cultural determinism says, look, there are no restraints on people and the advancements they can make on society. Basically, it's just this idea that there are no restraints except what restraints people put on themselves. and this is going to be based upon their culture. So if their culture decides for them what is it that will and will not be acceptable. You think about, I made mention of this, I believe, in my last video. You think about Islamic and Jewish traditions not wanting to eat pigs. It's not because pigs weren't there. It's because they were considered to be unclean animals. You look at some Islamic countries, and in terms of their view of women and how women should behave in public. So that's what's going to keep their society from moving to a freer society where women are able to more fully participate, and might even hinder their economy because they're not able to have the best and the brightest involved in those types of things. So the culture is what's going to be holding those people back, holding their societies back, and not necessarily the environment itself. Again, it's this idea that these restraints are not environmental restraints, rather they are cultural restraints. And so humans are going to shape the environment no matter what. But basically, the only restrictions are going to be some sort of lack of desire to shape the environment in the way that might be helpful to them. And I mean, it could be any lack of desire, whether it's a religious lack of desire, maybe there's some sort of moral restraint. Even in the United States, there are certain places that we consider to be off limits. Redwood Forest, we're not going to cut that down just to make more room for houses. We consider that to be a place that should be preserved, and so even our culture values some of those places and things like that, and so we're not going to infringe upon that. Now, within cultural determinism, one of the things that's absolutely necessary is advanced technologies to allow us to overcome some of the environmental barriers. So if you look at possibilism, one of the reasons that possibilism comes about is because some of the technologies are not available. Well, now that we have technologies that allow us to do things like fracking to get natural gas and oil in places that previously were not available to us, our ability to build cities and roads and place infrastructure in places in places that in prior years were it just was unthinkable. This whole idea of hydroponics and growing plants in water, and being able to turn places that were infertile into fertile areas, and the new hybrid plants and new seed technologies that we have out. So things that before seemed absolutely impossible are now possibilities, and helping us to overcome some of those environmental restraints. And so that's really helpful with cultural determinism. And so you can see how this progression takes place, especially over time, as new advancements are made, and then it helps us to get kind of a different picture of what people are capable of. All right, so that's it for this time. Thanks for listening, and come back next time when we're going to talk about some of the specific elements of culture.